The smell of white lilies was so heavy I could taste it in the back of my throat. First Baptist Church in Beaufort, South Carolina. 80-year-old oak pews, stained glass catching the morning sun, bleeding red and blue light across the cold stone floor. I sat in the front row. My new black dress had a paper tag still tucked inside the collar. It scratched my neck every time I bowed my head. Curtis sat next to me. He wore the exact same dark suit he wore to our wedding 15 years ago. My stomach tightened into a knot. Behind us, Archer sat completely straight, his knuckles white around the funeral program. Bea leaned her head against her brother's shoulder. The reception line finally thinned out. Hands shaken, condolences murmured. Curtis placed a hand flat against my lower back and guided me toward a quiet alcove near the side exit. The grip was possessive, not comforting. I knew the difference. He reached into the inner pocket of that wedding suit and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He pressed it into my hands. "I have been thinking about this for a while, Tess," he said. His voice was low and perfectly steady, rehearsed. "I want out. Sign the papers." I looked at the envelope. I did not open it. "You picked today." I did not phrase it as a question. "It is just timing, sweetheart. We both know this has not been working." He waited for the tears. He waited for the collapse. I reached into my leather tote bag, the one with my initials embossed on the side. I pulled out my own manila envelope, same size, same color. I placed it directly on top of his. "Dad helped me file these 6 weeks ago," I said. My voice was as calm as it was when I read aloud to the 9th graders at the library. "Your name is already off everything." Curtis stared at the paper. Confusion flickered in his eyes, followed quickly by sheer disbelief. Then came the fear. He pulled out his phone. He dialed his lawyer. Voicemail. He dialed the joint bank account automated line. A robotic voice echoed faintly from the speaker, stating the account had been modified. He dialed his lawyer a second time. Blocked. His hand started to shake. The phone slipped from his fingers and cracked against the stone floor, sending spiderwebs of shattered glass across the screen. From the sanctuary, the organist began playing Amazing Grace. Someone had found grace today. Curtis had not. I felt no triumph watching him shatter, just a bone-deep exhaustion, and the cold, solid ground of truth beneath my feet. 8 weeks before my father died, my biggest worry was getting our taxes filed on time. It was a normal Saturday morning in January. The air blowing in from the Beaufort River smelled like salt and damp earth. "My name is Tessa Blaine. I am 38 years old, a high school librarian, a mother of 2. I spent my weekends pulling weeds in the tomato garden and balancing the household budget." Curtis had already left the house by 6 that morning. "Another job site meeting," he told me. I never asked for details. 15 years of marriage had taught me that asking questions only made my husband irritable. I picked up my phone and called my dad. "Dad, can I bring the tax paperwork over this afternoon?" "Bring everything," Hank said. His voice sounded thinner than it had the week before. "Tax returns, mortgage statements, bank statements, everything, Tessie. That is a lot of paper." I heard him cough softly. "Numbers do not lie, Tessie. People do." My dad was a retired forensic accountant. He was 67 years old. 4 months ago, a doctor sat us down in a sterile room and explained that liver cancer did not negotiate. Dad was dying. The disease had already taken 30 pounds off his frame, but his eyes remained sharp, the kind of eyes that could spot a single transposed digit in a ledger from across the room. I packed the paperwork into my tote bag. On the nightstand, my worn copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins caught the morning light. My mother had read it to me in her hospital bed right before she passed away 23 years ago. I ran my fingers over the spine, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the door. Curtis had left his expensive cologne lingering in the hallway. An expensive watch and fine cologne were rewards he bought himself for landing a big commercial contract. Or so he claimed. Dad sat at his kitchen table waiting for me. It was the same white Formica table I grew up eating cereal on. He had his system ready. Tax returns stacked on the left, bank statements in the middle, mortgage documents on the right. 2 cups of coffee sat near the edge. He drank his black. I added milk. Outside the window, a bitter winter wind rattled the branches of my mother's old camellia bush. It still produced flowers every year, even though no one pruned it. Dad put his reading glasses on. He picked up his wooden pencil and started with the tax returns. For 45 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the wall clock and the scratch of lead against paper. The fluorescent light hummed above us. Then, the scratching stopped. Dad picked up a mortgage statement. He frowned. He set it down and picked it up again, bringing it closer to his face. Tessa, when did you refinance? Refinance? I shook my head, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee. We didn't. Dad went perfectly still. He flipped to the next page, then the next. This mortgage statement says you refinanced 2 years ago, and again last year, and again 6 months ago. That is not right. Curtis handles the mortgage. Dad did not say a word. He placed 3 separate mortgage statements side by side on the formica. He used the tip of his pencil to underline the interest rates. With every new loan, the rate climbed higher. The terms stretched longer. It defied all financial logic. How much equity did you have built up? Dad asked, his tone entirely professional. At the original purchase, about $240,000 over 12 years. And now? Dad pointed the pencil eraser at the final number on the most recent statement. I leaned in. I looked at the bold print. My mouth opened, but the air simply backed up in my throat. $190,000. Gone. Extracted. I read the number again. And a third time. I placed both hands flat on the table because the room suddenly felt like it was tilting on a hidden axis. My brain rejected the digits. It slammed the door on the information. You do not just lose that kind of money. You do not lose the very walls keeping your children safe. I did not sign these documents, I whispered. I know. Just 2 words. My father knew my signature. He had seen it on thousands of birthday cards and school permission slips. The signature on the bottom line of the bank forms looked like mine. The loop of the T matched, but the tail of the B curved to the right instead of the left. A stranger would never notice. A forensic accountant would. I heard my father breathe heavily. Each inhale rattled in his chest. In that quiet kitchen, the entire foundation of my adult life quietly shifted. It did not explode. It just slid out of place. Every late-night meeting Curtis claimed to attend. Every time he told me money was tight this quarter while adjusting his expensive watch. Every time he patted my shoulder and told me he would handle the finances so I did not have to worry my pretty head about it. A cold wave washed over my skin, leaving goosebumps behind. Dad carefully set his pencil down. He pulled a folded handkerchief from his pocket, took off his glasses, and wiped the lenses in slow, deliberate circles. Let me look into this further. Do not say a single word to Curtis. Dad, I cannot just go home and pretend. Not yet. Do not say anything yet. I need to find out exactly where the money went. I nodded slowly. I stood up, carried my mug to the sink, and looked out the window. My mother's camellia bush stood firm against the wind. Sometimes things survive simply by learning how to live without any care at all. That entire week, I operated like a ghost haunting my own life. I woke up. I made scrambled eggs for the kids. I poured coffee into my husband's travel mug and handed it to him with a smile that felt like it might crack the skin of my face. I went to the high school and shelved biographies, pushing a squeaky metal cart through the narrow aisles, pretending the ground beneath my feet was still solid. I was waiting for my father to call. I was waiting for the numbers to make sense. When my dad finally slid that thick leather binder across his coffee table on Saturday night, he walked me through exactly how he had spent those 5 excruciating days. He told me the story in pieces, his voice raspy and exhausted, pausing to sip lukewarm coffee while I stared at the mountain of evidence he had built. While I was organizing paperback novels on a Monday morning, my father was parking his old sedan in front of the Beaufort County Recorder's office. He was a dying man. The cancer was eating his liver, stealing his breath, turning his skin the color of old parchment. But when he walked through those double-glass doors with a legal pad and a sharpened wooden pencil, he was not a cancer patient. He was a forensic accountant with 40 years of experience. He approached the public viewing desk right as the building opened. The clerk behind the counter had sighed, clearly annoyed by the early arrival. My father asked for certified copies of 3 specific property documents. The clerk muttered something about being the 3rd person that month pulling residential mortgage records. My father looked the young man dead in the eye and said he was the first one who happened to be the owner's father. The clerk printed the copies without another word. My dad carried those certified pages to a scratched wooden table in the corner of the room. He laid them out side by side. He saw the exact same thing he had seen on the tax returns, but now he had the official stamps. He saw the forged signatures. My name, written by a hand that shared a bed with me every night. He also noticed something else. All 3 refinancing documents were stamped by the exact same notary public. License number 4471. A person named R. Vickers. My dad wrote that name down in his spiral notebook. He noticed the title company listed on the paperwork was not a major bank or a reputable local firm. It was a tiny outfit called Low Country Settlement Services. Easy to manipulate, easy to bribe. He sat in his car for 20 minutes after leaving the county building, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes closed against the wave of nausea the cancer brought him. He could have spent that Monday resting. He could have spent it fishing with his grandson. Instead, he was hunting down a ghost trail of stolen equity, because he knew if he did not do it, no one else would. I would eventually find out the truth, but only after Curtis had drained the accounts entirely dry. On Tuesday and Wednesday, my dad followed the money. 40 years of auditing had taught him that cash never truly vanishes. It just changes shape. He cross-referenced our joint bank statements with public property tax records and uniform commercial code filings. It took him 48 hours to map the entire architecture of my husband's betrayal. $128,000 went directly to a property purchase. 14 Osprey Lane, located in Walterboro, over in Colleton County. The deed was a masterpiece of perjury. It listed the buyer as Curtis M. Webb, single man. My husband had signed a legal document declaring he had no wife. But Curtis did not live at 14 Osprey Lane. A woman named Denise Griggs lived there. Another $38,000 had been funneled into that property over the last 4 years. Monthly mortgage payments, utility bills, homeowners association dues. It was a slow, steady bleed from our family home into hers. Another $24,000 went to miscellaneous expenses. Hotel bills concentrated mostly in the first year. Receipts from a high-end jewelry store at the outdoor mall. Expensive restaurant charges that Curtis had written off on his business taxes as client entertainment. My husband was not just stealing from me, he was committing federal tax fraud to subsidize his infidelity. The final piece of the puzzle came from the State Highway Toll Authority. My father requested the transponder records for my husband's truck. The pattern on the spreadsheet was so clear it made my stomach physically ache when my dad finally showed it to me. 3 to 4 nights a week, for 4 solid years, my husband's truck passed through the toll booths on Interstate 95 South, heading straight toward Colleton County. It perfectly matched the timeline of the house purchase. The first year of the affair, they had met in local hotels. The second year, he bought her a house. My dad actually drove to Walterboro on Thursday afternoon. He parked across the street from 14 Osprey Lane. He told me it was a single-story ranch house with fresh white siding and a small front porch. Bright lantana flowers grew in neat ceramic pots by the door. A silver Lexus sat parked in the driveway. My dad traced the vehicle registration. Curtis had paid $18,000 in cash to cover the trade-in difference for that car. My dad sat in his idling sedan and stared at the house. He told me the worst part was how incredibly normal it looked. It did not look like a scandalous hideaway. It looked like the home of a happy, functioning family. My father had lived long enough to know that an affair of this magnitude was never just about sex. $190,000 meant Curtis was building a second life. He was building it with bricks stolen from his children's foundation. All of this led to Saturday evening, 7 weeks before the funeral. I pulled into my father's driveway after tucking Archer and Bee into their beds. Curtis had casually announced he was meeting a subcontractor for a late dinner to discuss a delayed shipment of lumber. I did not ask him where the meeting was. I did not ask for a name. I just watched him spray a heavy dose of his signature cologne in the hallway before he walked out the door. My father's living room felt like a time capsule. The faded floral sofa sat in the exact same spot it had occupied since my childhood. The air smelled of the heavy lemon wood polish my mother used to buy, a scent my dad stubbornly maintained 2 decades after her passing. The yellow glow of the brass reading lamp cast long shadows against the walls. My dad sat in his armchair. His reading glasses rested low on the bridge of his nose. A mug of black coffee sat on the coaster, no longer steaming. On the center of the wooden coffee table sat a thick, brown leather binder. It was at least 2 inches wide. The letters H.B. were embossed in gold on the bottom right corner. It was the binder he used for his most important audits before he retired. Next to it sat 3 neat stacks of mortgage documents, each flagged with differently colored sticky notes. My dad did not say hello. He leaned forward, his breathing shallow and labored, and pushed the heavy leather binder across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of my knees. "This is what I found," he said. I reached out. My fingers brushed the worn leather. I flipped the heavy cover open. The first page was a master spreadsheet. It was classic Hank Blaine. The columns were perfectly straight. Every cell was color-coded. Every single transaction had its own dedicated row. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked. My voice sounded very far away, like it belonged to someone standing out in the front yard. 15 years of your marriage," my dad said softly. "In numbers." He reached over and tapped the thick paper. "This column on the left is what Curtis told you. This column on the right is what actually happened." I looked down. I read the first row, then the second. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating. It was the longest 30 seconds of my entire life. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked off the seconds, loud as a hammer. "He refinanced our home?" I asked. "3 times. He forged your signature on all 3 applications. That is..." I stopped. I hunted the corners of my mind for a word big enough to hold the weight of what I was looking at. I could not find one. "A felony," my dad finished for me. "Yes." I kept my eyes glued to the columns. If I looked up, I felt like the room might spin completely out of control. Where did the money go? My father reached over and gently turned the page. A glossy photograph stared back at me. A white ranch house with a porch. Behind the photograph was a copy of a property deed. I saw the name Denise Griggs printed in stark black letters. I saw the date, 4 years ago. Below that was a timeline, drawn out in my father's meticulous architectural handwriting. 5 total years. 5 years of lies. I did not cry. Not immediately. The betrayal was too massive to process all at once. I just sat there reading the pages. I flipped one page over. I read the next. Then I flipped again. I read the documents with the practiced, mechanical rhythm of a librarian scanning a catalog. But every page I turned represented another year of my life that had been stolen. Another year of sleeping next to a man who was actively dismantling my future while holding my hand in the dark. My dad sat perfectly still. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not reach out to touch my arm. He had presented audit findings to hundreds of devastated business owners over his long career. He knew exactly what this moment required. You do not speak. You let the victim read. The numbers will always tell the story better than words ever could. I traced the name Denise Griggs with my index finger. "He did not even leave," I whispered. "No," my dad said. That was the most terrifying realization of all. Curtis had not packed a bag. He had not asked for a divorce. He had simply replicated the life he had with me, but in a different county, with a different woman. He wanted the house in Beaufort with the wife who cooked meatloaf and raised the children. And he wanted the house in Walterboro with the real estate agent who understood his ambitions. He did not choose between us. He just kept both, funding the new life by slowly bleeding the old one dry. The sheer entitlement of it made my throat burn. I finally looked up from the binder. I looked at the dark circles under my father's eyes. I looked at how loose his collared shirt fit around his collarbone. "How long have you known?" I asked. 2 weeks, since the afternoon we started your taxes. "Why did you not tell me immediately?" "Because I needed you to see the evidence," my dad said, his voice dropping to a fierce, protective rasp. "Not my words. I could not just give you suspicions. Numbers do not lie, Tessie. I taught you that." I stared at him. He was 67 years old. He had terminal liver cancer. He was supposed to be resting in a comfortable chair, watching old westerns, spending his final months doing whatever brought him peace. Instead, he had spent the last 14 days driving to county offices, pulling public records, fighting through exhaustion and nausea to build an airtight legal case. He did it for me. He poured the last reserves of his dying energy into protecting his daughter from a predator who happened to sleep in her bed. The dam finally broke. The tears came hot and fast, spilling over my eyelashes and dripping onto the collar of my sweater. I was not crying for my husband. I was crying for my father. I was crying because the only language he had to express the depth of his love was a spreadsheet of stolen money. My dad reached into his pocket, pulled out his handkerchief, and placed it on the table next to the binder. I picked it up and pressed it against my eyes. It smelled like peppermint and clean laundry. "What do you want to do, Tessie?" he asked. I held the handkerchief against my face for a long time. The image of the white ranch house burned behind my closed eyelids. I thought about Curtis coming home later that night. I thought about him checking on Archer and Bee, kissing their foreheads, smelling like another woman's perfume. I thought about the 15 years I had spent bending backwards to keep the peace, convinced that a quiet house was the same thing as a happy home. I lowered the cloth. The tears stopped. The cold, heavy knot that had lived in my chest for the last decade suddenly vanished, replaced by an icy, absolute clarity. "I want to keep the house," I said. "I want to keep the kids. and I want to make sure he walks away with absolutely nothing." My father gave a single, sharp nod. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. He reached into the back pocket of the leather binder and pulled out a crisp, white business card. He slid it across the table toward me. "Her name is Astrid Keogh," my dad said. "She is a family law attorney in Charleston. Her father was in my graduating class when I got my accounting degree. She specializes in high-asset divorces involving financial fraud. I called her on Thursday. She is waiting for your call on Monday morning." I picked up the heavy cardstock. The black lettering caught the light from the reading lamp. "I have to go back to that house tonight," I said, the reality of the situation finally settling over me. "I have to sleep in that bed." "Yes," my dad said. He closed the thick leather cover of the binder. "You have to go home. You have to ask him how his meeting went. You have to smile. And you cannot let him see a single crack in the glass until the trap is ready to spring." I looked at the closed binder. It looked like a weapon sitting on the coffee table, a bomb waiting for a countdown. I slipped the lawyer's card into my pocket. "Okay," I said. "I am ready." I sat in my car in my own driveway for 10 full minutes before I found the courage to turn the engine off. The dashboard clock glowed in the dark of the cabin. It was just past 9 in the evening. The thick cardstock of the Charleston attorney sat heavy in my coat pocket, burning a hole through the fabric. My father had handed me the map. Now I had to walk into a house built on stolen money and pretend I did not know the floorboards were completely rotten. The crisp winter air bit at my cheeks as I stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched under my boots. I stopped at the front door, staring at the brass knob. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold air, and turned the lock. A blast of warm air from the furnace hit my face. The low, steady murmur of a college football game echoed from the television in the living room. I walked quietly down the short hallway and stopped under the archway. Curtis was sprawled across the sofa. Bea was sound asleep, her small head resting comfortably on his thigh, her soft breathing rising and falling in rhythm. Archer lay on his stomach on the living room rug, a thick history textbook open in front of him. It looked exactly like a television commercial. The devoted, hard-working provider relaxing with his beautiful children after a long week of building the community. The nausea hit me so fast and so violently that I had to grip the edge of the entryway table to keep from doubling over. I pressed my fingernails deep into the polished wood. I forced my jaw to unlock. I forced the corners of my mouth to curve upward into a shape that resembled a smile. I walked past them and went straight into the kitchen. I turned on the faucet and let the freezing water rush over my wrists, staring blindly out the dark window. Heavy boots sounded on the hardwood floor. Curtis walked up behind me. He wrapped his thick arms around my waist and pulled my back against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder. "You okay, Tess?" he asked softly. "You seem off tonight." The smell hit the back of my throat before the words fully registered. Aqua di Gio. It was thick, overwhelming. Men who have been managing dusty construction sites all day do not smell like freshly sprayed designer cologne at 9 o'clock at night. They smell like drywall and stale sweat. He had sprayed the cologne inside his truck right before walking through the front door. He used it like a chemical armor. He needed to burn away the scent of whatever cheap perfume she wore before he kissed his children goodnight. "I am just worried about Dad," I said to our reflection in the dark glass of the window. "He is tough, darling," Curtis murmured. He kissed the side of my neck. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the edge of the stainless steel sink so I would not shove him backward. "He will be fine." Curtis stepped back and let out a long, heavy sigh. He rubbed the back of his neck like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Money is tight this quarter, Tess," he said, opening the refrigerator to look for leftovers. "That Riverside commercial project is bleeding us dry right now. We might need to tighten the belt a little bit around here." I turned around and looked at him. I looked at the heavy silver watch catching the overhead kitchen light. A Rolex Submariner. $9,000 of stolen equity strapped directly to his wrist. I did not scream. I did not throw the coffee pot at his head. I just looked at my husband, a man I had shared a bed with for 5,475 nights. For the last 1,825 of those nights, he had possessed another house, another woman, and a completely different set of keys. "Okay," I said, my voice steady and hollow. "Whatever we need to do." He smiled, patted my shoulder, and carried his plate of cold meatloaf back to the living room. The performance had officially begun. I realized right then that pretending nothing had changed was going to be far more exhausting than the grief itself. On Monday morning, I took a personal day from the high school library. I drove an hour and a half up the coast to Charleston. The law offices of Astrid Keogh were located downtown on Church Street, housed in a beautiful, historic brick building that looked like it had stood there for 2 centuries. The waiting room smelled like old paper and expensive floor wax. Astrid Keogh did not waste time with gentle pleasantries or offering me a box of tissues. She was 54 years old, with a sharp silver bob and dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She motioned for me to sit in the leather chair opposite her massive mahogany desk. My father's thick brown leather binder was already sitting open in front of her. "Your father sent me a preview of these files over the weekend," Astrid said. She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the top spreadsheet. "Mrs. Blaine, this is one of the cleanest, most comprehensive fraud documentations I have ever seen from someone operating outside a courtroom." "My dad was a forensic accountant for 40 years, I said. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. "He knows how to trace a dollar." "He certainly does," Astrid agreed. She closed the binder and folded her hands over the leather cover. "Let me explain the landscape of South Carolina family law. We are going to file a petition for a fault-based divorce. Adultery is the primary ground. Under state law, proven adultery completely bars the cheating spouse from receiving any alimony whatsoever. That is our first weapon." I nodded, absorbing the clinical precision of her words. Astrid held up 3 fingers. "Then we have the 3 forged mortgage refinances. That elevates this situation from a messy domestic dispute to a felony criminal matter. We can, and we will, file a separate criminal complaint with the district attorney." "What about the house he bought her in Walterboro?" I asked. The memory of the stolen $190,000 still burned in my chest. "He took our equity to pay for it." "Dissipation of marital assets," Astrid replied smoothly. "The court will credit that entire amount backward. When the judge calculates the equitable distribution of the remaining estate, that stolen money counts heavily against his share. With the fault factors, the adultery, and the financial fraud, you are looking at walking away with significantly more than half. You will keep your home. You will keep your retirement." Astrid leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly. The quiet authority in the room forced me to sit up straighter. "But we have to control the narrative," she instructed. "We file the petition immediately, but we file it under seal. We establish you as the plaintiff on the public record before he ever sees it coming. We build the trap in complete silence, Mrs. Blaine. We wait, and we let him walk blindly into it." "File it," I said without hesitation. Astrid offered a small, approving smile. "One question. Does your father want to be formally involved in the investigation moving forward?" "He wants to finish what he started," I told her. I walked out of the brick building and into the bright Charleston sunlight. I got into my car, but I did not drive back to Beaufort. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed the numbers in the binder to become real. I merged onto Interstate 95 South. I settled into the fast lane and drove the exact same route my husband drove 3 or 4 nights a week. I watched the tall pine trees blur past the passenger window. I approached the first highway toll booth. I handed the attendant $1.25. I drove further down the interstate. I stopped at the second toll booth and paid again. The math started running through my head, cold and precise, just the way my father had taught me. 4 trips a week, 52 weeks a year, 5 entire years, $2.50 round trip. That meant my husband had spent roughly $2,600 just on highway tolls to go sleep with another woman. It was a tiny number compared to the massive mortgage fraud, but somehow, the mundane specificity of the toll fees made the betrayal feel brutally intimate. It proved the sheer logistical effort required to lie to me. I crossed the county line into Colleton County. I took the exit for Walterboro. The directions my dad had given me led me deep into a quiet, respectable suburban neighborhood. I turned onto Osprey Lane. I slowed the car to a crawl, house number 14. I parked my car across the street, shifting into park and turning the engine off. I rolled the window down a single inch. The afternoon air tasted like marsh salt and dry winter grass. It was a single-story ranch house with pristine white siding and dark shutters. A small, welcoming front porch faced the quiet street. Bright yellow and orange lantana flowers thrived in expensive ceramic pots near a woven welcome mat. A silver Lexus sat gleaming in the driveway. The house looked infuriatingly normal. It looked clean. It looked decent. It looked exactly like the kind of place where neighbors brought over warm casseroles and husbands swept the porch on Saturday mornings. The front door opened. I held my breath. A woman stepped out onto the porch. Denise Griggs. She was 33 years old. She wore a light floral sundress that moved softly in the winter breeze, and a heavy leather laptop bag was slung casually over her shoulder. Her brown hair caught the afternoon sun, revealing expensive, carefully painted highlights. She turned around and locked the front door with a brass key. She walked down the short concrete path to the silver Lexus. She slid behind the wheel, backed smoothly out of the driveway, and drove away down the quiet suburban street without ever noticing the woman sitting in the parked car across the road. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time. The engine was off, and the silence inside the cabin was deafening. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck despite the chill in the air. I finally understood exactly what Curtis had done. He had not abandoned his life. He had simply duplicated it. He wanted a quiet, dependable wife to maintain his primary home, pack the school lunches, and raise his children. But he also wanted the thrill of a younger real estate agent in a neighboring county. He did not want to make a choice between stability and excitement, so he decided to simply keep us both. He built an exact replica of domestic tranquility 30 miles away, and he used the equity from my home to buy the bricks for hers. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of his compartmentalization made my hands shake against the leather wrapping of the steering wheel. He truly believed he was smart enough to sustain a parallel universe forever. He thought I was just a quiet librarian who would never bother to look at a bank statement. I put the car in drive. I navigated back to the highway. I drove straight into Beaufort, bypassing my neighborhood entirely. I parked the car near the downtown waterfront. The thick Spanish moss hung heavy from the massive oak trees lining the riverbank. The dark waters sparkled under the late afternoon sun. This was the exact spot where Curtis had proposed to me 15 years ago. He had stood right by the iron railing, holding a small velvet box, promising that he would always take care of me, promising that I would never have to worry about a single thing as long as he was by my side. I sat down on a cold wooden bench facing the water. I listened to a mockingbird singing somewhere hidden in the high branches above. I watched a pair of small fishing boats drift slowly across the distant horizon. The cold thing that had been sleeping behind my ribs was fully awake now. I reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out my phone, and dialed my father's number. He answered on the second ring. He sounded incredibly tired. "I saw the house," I told him, my voice carrying clear and sharp over the sound of the river wind. "I am ready. We begin." The very next morning, the real work began. For the next 2 weeks, my life split into two completely separate realities. During the day, I was the quiet high school librarian, smiling at students and organizing the biography section. In the evenings, I became my father's apprentice in the art of financial ruin. Every night after I fed the kids and made sure their homework was finished, I drove over to my dad's house. The routine never varied. The house always smelled faintly of camphor, old paper, and the bitter black coffee he brewed, but could no longer stomach drinking. He would be sitting at the white Formica kitchen table, the overhead fluorescent light buzzing a low, steady hum. Directly in the center of the table sat the brown leather binder. It was an old thing, its edges worn soft from decades of use. The letters HB stamped into the bottom right corner in fading gold foil. My dad used to carry that exact binder into corporate boardrooms when he was hired to uncover millions of dollars in embezzled corporate funds. Now, it held the entire anatomy of my dead marriage. We sat shoulder to shoulder for hours. My dad taught me how to read the language of deception. He did not do this because I needed to know the legal mechanics for the divorce. Astrid Keogh was handling all the legal maneuvering up in Charleston. My dad taught me because he knew his liver was failing, and he needed to know I would never be easily fooled again after he was gone. He was not just building a case against my husband. He was forging a suit of armor for me to wear for the rest of my life. "Look at the signature on the refinancing document from 2 years ago," my dad said one evening. His voice was growing softer, requiring me to lean in close to hear him over the ticking of the wall clock. I stared at the black ink on the certified copy. "It looks exactly like mine. If a bank teller saw it, they would accept it without a second thought." "Now look at the tail of the B," he instructed, tapping the paper with the eraser of his wooden pencil. "Your B always curves to the left at the bottom. It always has, ever since you learned cursive in the 3rd grade. This one curves to the right. The pen pressure is also completely wrong." The forger hesitated at the top of the loop. "How do you even notice something that small?" I asked, shaking my head. 40 years, Tessie," he said, offering a weak, dry smile. "I have been staring at signatures since before you were born. The devil never hides in the big numbers. The big numbers are always manipulated to look perfect. The devil hides in the margins. He hides in the small, lazy mistakes. He coughed then, a deep, rattling sound that shook his frail shoulders. I reached over and handed him a glass of water. His hands trembled as he took it. The cancer was moving fast. Every time I looked at him, it seemed another layer of his physical strength had been stripped away. His cheekbones jutted out sharply against his pale skin. But the moment he opened that brown leather binder, the weakness vanished from his eyes. The numbers kept him anchored to the earth. The sheer, cold logic of the spreadsheets pumped adrenaline through his veins when his liver could no longer filter his blood. By the end of the second week, the binder contained exactly 47 pages. Every single stolen dollar was accounted for. Every fraudulent notary stamp from R. Vickers was highlighted in bright yellow ink. Every highway toll receipt proving Curtis drove down Interstate 95 south toward Colleton County was cross-referenced with the dates of his supposed late-night construction meetings. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It was a loaded weapon, and my dad was carefully teaching me how to pull the trigger. While my father and I built the financial evidence in the quiet of his kitchen, Astrid Keogh was moving pieces across the legal chessboard in total silence. The strategy was systematic and utterly ruthless. Astrid filed the fault-based divorce petition under seal with the county court. I was officially the plaintiff. Curtis would not have the slightest clue he was being divorced until the moment the process server handed him the papers. The grounds were clearly stated: adultery, fraud, dissipation of marital assets. But the divorce was only the first line of attack. The second line of attack came from my father. My dad knew exactly what kind of predator my husband was. Curtis had already stolen $190,000 of my home equity, but my dad knew Curtis was patiently waiting for an even bigger payday. My father owned his property free and clear, worth roughly $350,000, plus another $90,000 in liquid savings. Curtis knew the cancer was terminal. He had already casually asked me twice about my dad's estate planning, pretending to be concerned about probate taxes. Curtis was waiting for my father to die so the inheritance would transfer to me, hoping it would be deposited into our joint account, where it would legally become shared marital property. My dad shut that door completely and permanently. Working with Astrid and an estate planner, my dad moved every single asset he owned into an irrevocable trust. It was a legal fortress. The sole beneficiaries of the trust were my two children, Archer and Bee. I was named as the trustee, giving me complete control over how the funds were distributed for their education and well-being. Because the trust was irrevocable, the assets completely bypassed my personal marital estate. Curtis would never be able to touch a single copper penny of my father's life work. I had my own quiet errands to run during those weeks. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I took my lunch break and drove to a completely different banking institution on the other side of town. The marble floor of the lobby echoed under my boots as I walked up to the teller window. I opened a new checking account in my name only. I filled out the direct deposit paperwork to reroute my library salary away from the joint account I shared with Curtis. I rented a small safe deposit box in the bank vault. I placed copies of my birth certificate, the children's social security cards, and a digital backup drive of the 47-page forensic report inside the dark metal box. When I walked out of that bank and back into the rain, the air felt different in my lungs. I had a secret life now. I had a hidden account, a hidden lawyer, and a hidden strategy. For 15 years, my husband had expertly managed a parallel existence, living in 2 houses with 2 women. Now, I was building a parallel existence of my own, right under his nose. The irony tasted like copper on my tongue. The hardest part of the entire operation was not the legal maneuvering or the long nights deciphering spreadsheets. The hardest part was turning the key in my own front door and walking into my house. I had to be the perfect wife. Every single day, I had to strap a mask to my face and perform. 4 weeks before the funeral, Curtis came home late on a Thursday night. It was past 9 o'clock. I was standing at the kitchen sink, scrubbing a baking pan under hot water. The house was quiet. Archer was asleep on the living room sofa, with a book resting on his chest, and Bee was tucked into her bed upstairs. The front door opened and shut. Heavy boots thumped against the hardwood floor. Before Curtis even walked into the kitchen, the smell announced his arrival. Acqua di Gio. It was incredibly strong, practically stinging my nostrils. He had sprayed it heavily inside the cabin of his truck before walking up the driveway. I knew exactly what that meant now. He was washing away the scent of Denise Griggs. He was washing away the scent of the white ranch house in Walterboro before he leaned down to kiss my son on the forehead. "Hey there, beautiful," Curtis said. stepping into the kitchen. He looked tired, but it was the satisfied, relaxed exhaustion of a man who had just spent the evening exactly how he wanted. "Long day?" I asked, not looking up from the soapy water in the sink. My voice was perfectly even. "Brutal," he sighed, dropping his keys onto the counter with a loud clatter. "Long day at the Riverside project. We had concrete pouring issues all afternoon. I feel like I have been chewing on dust since noon." I turned the faucet off and reached for a kitchen towel. I dried my hands slowly, pressing the rough cotton against my skin to ground myself. I walked over to the refrigerator and pulled out a plate covered in aluminum foil. "I saved you some meatloaf and potatoes," I said, setting the plate in the microwave. "You are an angel, Tess," he said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table and sitting down heavily. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I mean it. I do not know what I would do without you holding down the fort here." The microwave hummed. I watched the orange numbers count down. I wanted to tell him he would do exactly what he was already doing. He would go to his other house, with his other woman, bought with my stolen money. The microwave beeped. I pulled the warm plate out and set it on the table in front of him. I grabbed a fork and a paper napkin, placing them carefully beside the plate. Curtis picked up the fork. As he reached for the food, the kitchen light caught the heavy silver medal strapped to his left wrist. It was a Rolex Submariner. It had a dark face and a thick, gleaming band. He had bought it for himself 3 years ago. I remembered the exact day he brought it home. He had smiled that charming, asymmetrical smile of his and told me it was his reward for landing a massive commercial contract at the harbor. He said a man in his position needed to project success to attract bigger clients. It cost $9,000. I now knew, because of the brown leather binder sitting on my father's coffee table, that there was no massive commercial contract at the harbor 3 years ago. The $9,000 had been pulled directly from the second fraudulent refinancing of our home. I was staring at my own stolen equity ticking away the seconds on his wrist. "Money is going to be tight this quarter, darling," Curtis said around a mouthful of meatloaf. He pointed his fork at me. "I might need you to tighten the belt on the grocery budget for a few weeks." I stood perfectly still on the opposite side of the table. "Okay. I mean it," he continued, taking a sip of water. "That Riverside project is bleeding us right now. Material costs are through the roof. We need to be careful with every dollar." I looked at his face. I looked for any sign of hesitation, any microscopic flicker of guilt behind his eyes. There was nothing. He was staring right at me, lying to my face with the easy, practiced breathing of a sociopath. He actually believed his own performance. He thought I was just the naive school librarian who would clip coupons to help him through a tough business quarter, completely unaware that he had spent my children's inheritance on a suburban love nest for his mistress. "Maybe we should sit down and look at our finances together," I suggested softly. I tilted my head, keeping my expression perfectly innocent. "I could help you balance the ledgers. You know, my dad taught me a few things." Curtis stopped chewing. For half a second, his fork hovered in the air. His eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch, scanning my face for any hidden meaning. He found none. My mask was flawless. "Nah," he said, offering a dismissive chuckle. He went back to cutting his meatloaf. "I have got it handled, Tess. I always do. Do not worry your pretty head about the numbers. That is my job." I smiled. A real, genuine smile spread across my face. "You are right. You always handle everything." I turned my back to him and walked over to wipe down the countertops. The power balance in the room was a tangible, physical thing, and Curtis was completely blind to it. He thought he was holding all the cards. He thought he was the architect of my reality. He thought his control over me was absolute. But as I wiped the damp sponge in slow circles across the granite, I realized something profound. The man sitting behind me eating cold meatloaf was already a ghost. He just did not know he was dead yet. Every single piece of his life was currently being dismantled in the shadows. His bank accounts were about to be frozen. His inheritance strategy had been completely obliterated by a dying accountant. His criminal forgery was being neatly packaged for the district attorney. His fault-based divorce was already sitting quietly in a courthouse file, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate. I did not feel angry as I listened to him scrape his fork against the ceramic plate. I felt a cold, sweeping sense of peace. I had spent 15 years fearing the destruction of my family. I had compromised my own instincts to keep the peace, believing that an intact home was worth any sacrifice. But my father was right. A home built on a foundation of forged signatures and stolen equity was not a home at all. It was a cage. And I finally held the keys to the lock. I just had to wait for the clock to run out. 3.5 weeks before the funeral, I drove over to my father's house on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Archer was over at a friend's house working on a science project, and Bea was attending a birthday party at the local roller rink. Curtis had kissed my cheek that morning and told me he was meeting a subcontractor to review some drywall estimates. I did not bother to track his location. I already knew exactly where he was. My dad's house was completely silent when I walked through the front door. The late afternoon sunlight filtered through the sheer lace curtains my mother had hung 25 years ago, casting delicate floral patterns across the scuffed hardwood floor. I found him sitting at the white Formica kitchen table. The heavy brown leather binder lay open in front of him. 3 neat stacks of paper were pushed to the side. A mug of coffee sat near his elbow, completely untouched and entirely cold. Something else sat on the table today. It was a thick manila envelope, heavily sealed with dripping red wax. I pulled out a wooden chair and sat down. The smell of camphor from his old medicine cabinet mixed with the stale coffee. I listened to his breathing. Every inhale sounded like a terrible struggle, much shallower and significantly wetter than it had been just a week prior. He tapped his pencil against the open binder. It was the final page. Page 47. "It is finished," my dad said quietly. I looked down at the summary sheet. He had organized everything into a final accounting of my husband's betrayals. Every single line represented a separate crime. The dates of the forged signatures, the fraudulent notary stamps, the property purchase in Colleton County, the total amount siphoned from my home equity over 5 years. At the very bottom of the page, a final number sat underlined twice in heavy black graphite: $214,800. $214,000, I whispered, the sheer magnitude of the theft making the room feel suddenly small. "And change," my dad replied, a dry, bitter humor touching the corners of his mouth. I calculated the lost interest and the opportunity cost. "The change matters too. Tessie, this is everything?" I asked. "This is everything that left a clear paper trail," he explained, closing the heavy leather cover. "There is probably cash I cannot track. Dinners, gifts, things bought out of sight. But this is enough. This is more than enough to bury him." My dad pushed the sealed manila envelope across the smooth formica. The red wax caught the afternoon sunlight. It was an old habit of his. Whenever he finished a major forensic audit for the court, he always sealed the final findings in wax to ensure the chain of custody remained unbroken. I looked at the name written across the front in his meticulous handwriting: Floyd Griggs. "What is inside this?" I asked, keeping my hands carefully folded in my lap. "Everything Floyd needs to know," my dad answered. "A copy of the property deed for 14 Osprey Lane, photographs of Curtis entering and leaving the house, the 5-year timeline, the jewelry receipts, and a letter." I stared at the thick envelope. "What does the letter say?" "It says that his wife is living a second life with my daughter's husband," my dad said, his voice dropping to a low, absolute rumble. "And it explains that the beautiful house he thinks his wife bought with her real estate commissions was actually paid for with stolen money." I reached out and touched the rough paper. It felt incredibly heavy. My father was not just protecting me, he was acknowledging that there was another victim in this wreckage. Floyd Griggs was a working man, a local electrician who thought he was building a life with a successful woman. My dad's moral compass demanded that justice be completely balanced. Curtis had betrayed me, and Denise had betrayed Floyd. This envelope was an absolute guarantee that both of them would face the consequences. "You deliver this to Floyd," my dad instructed, pointing a trembling finger at the wax seal. "The day after the funeral, not a single hour sooner." I looked up from the table, my brow furrowing in confusion. "Why after the funeral?" My dad held my gaze. His eyes were still sharp, still the eyes of a man who could spot a lie buried under 1,000 pages of tax returns. "Because at the funeral, Curtis is going to think he has won," my dad said. "He is going to hand you divorce papers right there at the church." All the air rushed out of my lungs. "At the funeral?" "He has been planning it," my dad explained, reaching for his glass of water. "Astrid hired a private investigator to monitor their movements. Denise's lawyer contacted the county courthouse last week to check the standard timelines for probate and inheritance filings. Astrid was notified immediately. Curtis is not just waiting for me to die, Tessie. He is strategically timing the divorce around my death." I sat perfectly still. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. "He wants to establish an official date of separation at the earliest possible moment," my dad continued, setting his water glass down. "He wants to serve you before the inheritance from my estate is officially processed." If you accidentally deposit any of my money into your joint account before you are legally separated, Curtis and his lawyer will argue that the funds have been commingled. He will try to take half of everything I am leaving you. The world shifted beneath me for the second time. The first time was when I realized my husband was a thief. This time was far worse. Curtis was actively waiting for my father to stop breathing so he could orchestrate a final, devastating financial grab. He knew the exact prognosis of the cancer. He knew my father only had weeks left. He was sitting at our dinner table, kissing my children goodnight, while patiently circling my father's deathbed like a vulture waiting for the end. I did not feel a single drop of grief for my marriage in that moment. I felt a cold, surgical clarity, the kind of clarity my father had lived with for 40 years. He is planning his exit around your death, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He is planning his exit around the money, my dad corrected gently. My death is simply the trigger he is waiting for. My dad opened the small drawer of the kitchen table and pulled out a tiny silver computer drive. He set it on top of the heavy binder. This is the digital backup, he said. Everything in the binder is on here. Send it to Astrid tonight. I am a forensic accountant, Tessie. We always keep a backup. The psychological weight of the performance grew heavier every single day. I had to maintain the illusion of the devoted wife while carrying the knowledge of his absolute depravity. The cracks began to show, 3 weeks before the funeral. It was a Wednesday night. I was standing over the stove, stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce. Curtis sat at the kitchen island, nursing a beer and complaining about the cost of lumber. Archer was doing his math homework at the dining table, and Bee was coloring on the floor. It was a picture of perfect domestic routine. Then, my husband's cell phone buzzed violently against the granite countertop. The screen lit up. Curtis glanced at the caller identification. For half a second, his jaw tightened. A microscopic flicker of panic crossed his eyes before he quickly reached out and pressed the button to decline the call. He shoved the phone face down onto the counter. "Just a subcontractor?" he muttered, taking a quick sip of his beer. "I will call him back tomorrow." Before I saw the brown leather binder, I would have nodded and gone back to stirring the sauce. But I saw everything now. "Who was that?" I asked. Curtis looked up, clearly surprised. I never questioned his work calls. "I just told you," he said, forcing a casual smile. "It was a sub from the Riverside site." "At 8 o'clock at night?" I asked, keeping my voice mild but holding his gaze. Silence stretched across the kitchen. The bubbling of the tomato sauce sounded incredibly loud. From the dining table, Archer stopped moving his pencil. He looked up from his math workbook and stared quietly at his father. Bee stopped coloring. "Construction does not run on banker hours, Tess," Curtis said. The casual smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, warning edge in his tone. He was telling me to back down. I turned back to the stove. I picked up the wooden spoon and resumed stirring. The mask slid back into place, but it felt suffocating. I realized then that my performance was not just fooling Curtis. It was fooling my children. I was actively lying to them, forcing them to live inside a fragile glass house that was destined to shatter. The deception made my skin crawl. I needed the clock to run out faster. I needed this to be over. The universe answered that prayer at 2 o'clock in the morning, exactly 2.5 weeks before the funeral. My cell phone vibrated against the nightstand, loud and jarring in the pitch-black bedroom. I snatched it up before it could wake Curtis. The caller identification showed the main desk of Beaufort Memorial Hospital. A soft, clinical voice on the other end delivered the news. My father had collapsed and was being admitted through the emergency room. I threw on a pair of jeans and a heavy sweater. I drove the 15 minutes to the hospital in complete darkness. The streets of Beaufort were completely empty. The Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oak trees looked like pale ghosts caught in the glow of the amber streetlights. I parked in the emergency lot and rushed through the sliding glass doors. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor blinked overhead. My rubber soles squeaked against the polished linoleum floor. I found him in a small room at the end of the hall. He looked terribly small. The hospital gown swallowed his thin frame, and his shoulders jutted sharply against the thin white blanket. Clear plastic tubes ran across the back of his bruised hands. A monitor mounted to the wall beeped in a slow, monotonous rhythm. His eyes were open. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he did not offer a comforting smile. "Bring the binder," he ordered, his voice weak but absolutely commanding. A young doctor stepped into the hallway and pulled me aside. He spoke in low, apologetic tones. The liver function was declining much faster than they had anticipated. The timeline had shifted drastically. We were no longer looking at months. We were looking at weeks, possibly just days. I walked back into the cold room and pulled a plastic chair close to the edge of the bed. I reached out and took my father's hand. His skin was freezing, feeling more like brittle bone than human flesh. "I already heard what the doctor said," my dad whispered, staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. "Dad, you do not need to worry about anything right now," I pleaded, tears finally pooling in my eyes. "Just rest." "Tessa, listen to me," he said, turning his head slowly to face me. The absolute sharpness in his eyes cut straight through my grief. "The timeline has changed. That means our strategy has to change. I know Curtis is waiting. He will make his move the moment my heart stops. He will try to serve you at the funeral." "At the funeral," I repeated, the sickness churning in my stomach. "Yes," my dad said, squeezing my fingers with a surprising amount of strength. "You have to be ready. When he hands you those papers at the church, you do not argue with him. You do not ask him for an explanation. You do not give him the satisfaction of an audience." He coughed, a wet, terrible sound, before catching his breath. "You pull your papers out of your bag," he instructed, his breathing ragged. "You put them right on top of his. You look him in the eye and you say, 'Dad helped me file these 6 weeks ago. Your name is already off everything.' And then you turn your back and you walk away." I stared at the man in the hospital bed. He was dying. Monitors tracked his fading heartbeat. Plastic tubes fed fluids into his collapsing veins. But his mind was still operating like a master tactician on a battlefield. He was spending his final conscious hours planning the exact choreography of my liberation. He was using every single breath he had left to make sure his daughter would survive the storm. I wanted to beg him to stop. I wanted to tell him that the money did not matter, that the house did not matter, that nothing mattered except him. But I kept my mouth shut. I knew that if I asked him to stop working, I would be asking him to stop living. The strategy, the numbers, the protection of his family, this was the oxygen keeping him alive. "What about Archer and Bee?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They will stay with Archer's best friend for the afternoon," my dad said firmly. "I already arranged it with his mother last week. The kids do not need to see the confrontation. They need to be shielded from the fallout." I sat in that hard plastic chair until 3 in the morning. My father finally closed his eyes and drifted into a restless, medicated sleep. The heart monitor beeped in the quiet room. Beep, beep, beep. Outside the small window, the marshland was shrouded in total darkness, smelling of pluff mud and impending rain. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened my messages. I typed a text to Astrid Keogh in Charleston. "Accelerate everything. We might only have 2 weeks left." I hit send. I expected to hear back from her assistant sometime the next morning. My phone buzzed in my hand exactly 4 minutes later. "Already on it," Astrid wrote. "Your father called me at midnight." I lowered the phone and looked at my dad sleeping in the pale hospital light. He had called the attorney before he even called the ambulance. He had secured the legal filings before he allowed the doctors to treat his failing liver. That was how Hank Blaine loved his family. He built the fortress first, and only then did he allow himself to rest inside it. I leaned back in the plastic chair and kept my eyes on the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. The clock had officially run out of months. We were down to the final days. The trap was fully set, and my husband was walking happily toward the edge of the cliff. 2 weeks before the funeral, Curtis began to notice the subtle shifts in the atmosphere of our home. Predators always notice when their hunting ground changes. I was leaving the house much more frequently. When he asked where I was going, I told him I was visiting my dad at the hospital. That was the truth, but it was not the entire truth. I was also driving up to Charleston to sit in a leather chair across from Astrid Keogh. I was visiting the new bank to deposit my library paychecks into my private account. Curtis also noticed the small technological walls I had erected. My laptop, which used to sit open and unguarded on the kitchen counter, was now constantly tucked inside my tote bag. My cell phone had a new passcode. He did not suspect I knew about Denise Griggs. His absolute arrogance prevented him from imagining I was capable of uncovering his parallel life. Instead, his suspicion took a completely different, much darker path. He thought I was preparing for my father's death. He was incredibly worried about the inheritance. If I started looking closely at our joint financial accounts to deposit estate funds, I might notice the missing home equity. I learned just how deeply this worried him a few days later, when Astrid called me while I was shelving books at the high school. "Your husband is getting anxious," Astrid told me, her voice crisp and professional over the phone. "His business attorney just reached out to a colleague of mine. He was asking hypothetical questions about South Carolina estate law. He specifically wanted to know how long it takes for inherited property to become a shared marital asset. I gripped the edge of the metal book cart. What did they tell him? They told him the truth, Astrid replied smoothly. If an inheritance is deposited into a joint bank account, it is immediately commingled. It becomes marital property. If it is kept in a separate, solitary account, the spouse has absolutely no claim to it. He wants to make sure I put my dad's money into the joint account, I whispered, the cold reality settling over my skin. Exactly, Astrid said. He wants to secure his claim to your father's estate before he files for divorce. He just does not know that your father already built a brick wall around every single penny. The pressure on Curtis was not just coming from the impending inheritance. It was also coming from Walterboro. 10 days before the funeral, I drove to Beaufort Memorial Hospital right after my shift at the library ended. My dad was deteriorating quickly. The hospital room smelled of harsh bleach and the heavy, sweet scent of the pink camellias I had brought from my mother's garden. The monitor next to his bed beeped in a slow, tired rhythm. My dad waved me closer the moment I walked through the door. His breathing was incredibly shallow, but his eyes were bright with urgent energy. "Close the door, Tessie," he rasped. I pushed the heavy wooden door shut, sealing us inside the quiet room. I pulled a plastic chair directly next to his bed and took his hand. His skin felt like dry paper stretched tight over fragile bone. "Astrid just called me," my dad said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Her private investigator sent an updated report. Curtis has driven to Colleton County 3 times in the last 4 days. That is double his usual pattern." "Why?" I asked, leaning in closer. "Denise is pushing him," my dad explained. He squeezed my fingers, his grip surprisingly firm. 5 years is a long time to live on promises. She knows I am dying. She knows the inheritance is coming. She wants a firm commitment. She wants a wedding date, Tessie. And she wants her name on official paperwork. I stared at the white blanket covering my father's chest. Curtis was trapped in a vice of his own making. Denise was pushing him from one side, demanding he leave his wife. The ticking clock of my father's terminal cancer was pushing him from the other side, offering a massive financial windfall if he timed his exit perfectly. "When the other woman pushes, the cheating husband moves fast," my dad said quietly. "He cannot wait anymore. He contacted a divorce attorney yesterday. The investigator confirmed it." "Who did he hire?" I asked. "A firm in Walterboro," my dad replied. "The exact same firm Denise Griggs recommends to her real estate clients. She is helping him orchestrate the legal strategy against you." The absolute audacity of it stole the breath straight from my lungs. The woman living in a house funded by my stolen equity was now actively helping my husband plan my financial ruin. "He is going to ambush you," my dad continued, his eyes locked onto mine. "He needs to establish a legal date of separation immediately, before the probate process begins. He is going to hand you those papers the moment he thinks you are too broken to fight back." He did not need to say the exact location out loud. I already knew. The funeral. Curtis was going to use my darkest moment of grief as a tactical advantage. The absolute cruelty of the strategy was breathtaking. 8 days before the funeral, the atmosphere in the hospital room shifted. The urgent, tactical energy that had sustained my father for the past 6 weeks began to evaporate, leaving behind a profound, heavy stillness. I arrived at the hospital early in the morning. Outside the small window, the February sky was a bruised, overcast gray. A light drizzle blurred the view of the distant marshland. The heavy brown leather binder sat on the small table next to my father's bed. He had insisted I bring it from his house and leave it right there within his line of sight. One of the night nurses had assumed it was an old family photo album. I never bothered to correct her. My dad was awake, staring at the ceiling tiles. I walked over, poured a cup of water from the plastic pitcher, and held the straw to his dry lips. He took a small sip, swallowed heavily, and turned his head to look at me. "Tessie," he said, his voice barely a breath. "Sit down." I pulled the chair close. I took his hand in both of mine, resting them against my lap. "What do you need, Dad?" I asked softly. "I need you to listen to me," he said. "I do not want you to listen to the accountant today. I want you to listen to your father." I nodded, feeling the sudden, sharp sting of tears gathering in the corners of my eyes. 15 years, my dad said slowly. "You stayed with that man for 15 years because you were terrified." "I was trying to keep our family together," I argued gently, the old defensive reflex kicking in. "You were terrified," he repeated, refusing to let me hide behind the excuse. You were terrified that your children would grow up without a father. You were terrified of repeating what happened with your mother. You convinced yourself that keeping the marriage intact was the exact same thing as keeping the family intact. He stopped to catch his breath. The heart monitor beeped a steady, quiet rhythm in the background. "But you were wrong, Tessie," he said, his eyes burning with an intense, fierce love. "Family is not just a collection of people living under the same roof. Family is the absolute truth between those people. When the truth disappears, the family is already gone. All that is left is a hollow shell." I looked down at our joined hands. A single tear slipped free and fell onto his knuckles. I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid the empty spaces my mother had left behind. I had bent backward, swallowed my own voice, and ignored every single warning sign Curtis ever gave me, simply because I believed a broken home was the worst possible outcome for a child. "Your mother did not abandon us," my dad whispered, his voice cracking with old grief. "She died. I raised you by myself because I had absolutely no other choice. But you have a choice, Tessa. You have the choice that your mother never got to make." He squeezed my hand. "Do not stay inside the hollow shell," he commanded softly. "Leaving a man who steals from you is not destroying your family. He destroyed it 5 years ago. You are just cleaning up the wreckage." I nodded, the truth of his words settling deep into my bones, finally breaking the invisible chains I had carried for over a decade. I did not have to protect the illusion anymore. "One more thing," my dad said, turning his head slightly to look at the bedside table. He pointed a trembling finger at the brown leather binder. "The last page." I reached over and pulled the heavy binder onto my lap. I flipped past the spreadsheets, past the property deeds, past the notary stamps, all the way to page 47, but there was another page behind it now, page 48. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. It was covered in my father's handwriting. The letters were shaky and uneven, completely lacking his usual architectural precision, but every single word was legible. He had written it slowly, fighting through the pain to leave me one final message. It was a letter. It started with my name, Tessie. I started to read the first line, but my dad reached out and placed his hand over the paper. "Do not read it now," he instructed, his breathing growing heavier. "Read it when I am gone. Read it when you need to hear my voice." I closed the thick leather cover. I pulled the binder against my chest, wrapping my arms around it. The leather felt warm. It was heavy, with 47 pages of cold, hard numbers, and one single page of absolute love. My father had spent his entire life speaking the language of ledgers and audits. He could not separate the numbers from his affection. To him, tracing every stolen dollar and securing my financial future was the most profound declaration of love he could possibly make. I stayed with him for the rest of the day. The gray afternoon faded into a pitch-black night. The nurses came and went, checking his vitals and adjusting his pain medication. I listened to his breathing slow down, becoming a soft, rhythmic rattle in the quiet room. I received the phone call at exactly 4:47 in the morning on a Tuesday, 6 days before the funeral. I was lying in my own bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to Curtis snore softly beside me. When the phone vibrated against the nightstand, I already knew what the voice on the other end was going to say. "Miss Blaine," the hospital night supervisor said softly, "I am so sorry." 4 words. They hung in the cold air of my bedroom. I did not wake Curtis. I quietly slipped out from under the heavy comforter, pulled on a pair of jeans and a dark sweater, and grabbed my keys. I drove through the empty streets of Beaufort. The traffic lights blinked yellow at the deserted intersections. The world felt completely still, as if the entire town had paused to acknowledge the passing of a good man. I walked down the long, brightly lit hospital corridor. The door to my dad's room was wide open. The room was completely silent. It was a heavy, absolute silence. The heart monitor was turned off. The screens were dark. My dad lay perfectly still beneath the thin white hospital blanket, which had been pulled up neatly over his chest. His reading glasses rested on the table next to his bed. The brown leather binder was exactly where I had left it. It had outlasted him. I pulled the plastic chair up to the side of the bed. I reached out and took his hand. The skin was completely cold, holding none of the fierce warmth it had possessed just 2 days ago. I did not cry. The grief did not crash over me like a sudden, violent wave. It moved into the room slowly, like a rising tide, filling the space around me until it reached my chest and made it hard to breathe. I sat with him for 2 full hours. The morning shift nurses quietly peeked into the room, saw me sitting there. and gently closed the door to give me privacy. I talked to him. I kept my voice low, just a whisper in the silent room. I talked about my mother. I talked about the camellia bush in the garden. I talked about the worn copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins sitting on my nightstand. I thanked him for teaching me how to balance a checkbook when I was 16 years old, and I thanked him for balancing the ledgers one final time to save my life. When the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale, weak light through the window, stood up. I picked up his reading glasses and slipped them into my pocket. I picked up the heavy brown leather binder. I opened the bedside drawer and took out the thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, the one addressed to Floyd Griggs. I placed everything carefully into my leather tote bag. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed my husband's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Dad passed away," I said. My voice was completely flat. "Oh, Tess," Curtis said, shifting immediately into his practiced role. He sounded incredibly sympathetic. "I am so sorry, darling. I will get dressed and come straight to the hospital right now." "No," I told him, staring at the empty bed. "You do not need to come. I will handle everything here. Stay home with the kids until they wake up." I ended the call before he could argue. I felt no guilt for shutting him out. Inside my chest, I was holding two completely different emotions at the exact same time. The crushing, devastating grief for the loss of my father, and the cold, terrifying clarity of the weapons he had left behind. They did not cancel each other out. They existed together, fueling each other. I drove back to my house. It was 5:30 in the morning. The sky was turning a soft, bruised purple. I parked inside the garage and turned the engine off. I sat in the driver's seat with the leather tote bag resting on my lap. I pulled my phone out to check the time. There were 3 text messages waiting for me from Astrid Keogh. "I heard the news," her first message read. "I am so sorry for your loss, Tessa. Everything has been officially filed with the court," the second message stated. "We are ready," the final message said. Ready. I stared at the glowing screen, hating that specific word. Ready for what? Ready to bury the man who raised me? Ready to absolutely destroy my marriage? Ready to look my children in the eye and tell them their father was a criminal? I picked up the tote bag, stepped out of the car, and walked quietly into the dark house. I could hear Curtis moving around in the kitchen, making coffee, preparing to play the role of the grieving, supportive son-in-law. I walked straight past the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the master bedroom. I opened the closet door. I reached up to the highest shelf and moved a stack of old shoeboxes. I placed the brown leather binder and the wax-sealed envelope deep in the dark corner, completely out of sight, and covered them with a winter blanket. I was hiding the weapons, exactly the way my father had taught me. The night before the funeral of my father, the house was entirely silent, except for the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the man sleeping beside me. It was Friday, just past 2 o'clock in the morning. 5 days had passed since I sat in that cold hospital room and watched the life drain out of the greatest man I had ever known. Now, I was lying flat on my back in my own bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. Curtis was fast asleep. He had stayed home that evening, playing the role of the grieving, supportive husband for the neighbors who stopped by with covered dishes and quiet condolences. He lay on his side, his chest rising and falling in a deep, peaceful slumber. The faint scent of Acqua di Gio drifted over from his pillow. He had worn it all evening, masking whatever smells he carried from his afternoon errands. In the pitch black of the bedroom, a sudden, terrifying wave of doubt washed over me. My father's plan was absolutely perfect on paper. The financial records were flawless. The legal trap was completely set. But lying there in the dark, the sheer reality of executing that plan began to crush my chest. If I pulled the trigger tomorrow, I would be actively destroying everything I had built for the last 15 years. I would be blowing up the only home my children had ever known. Archer and Bea would become the kids with the broken family. They would be the kids whose father was investigated for multiple felony counts of financial fraud. The ghost of my own childhood trauma crept out from the dark corners of the room. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the exact hour when the mind plays its cruelest tricks. A quiet voice whispered in my ear, "If you divorce him, your children will end up exactly like you. They will be half orphans. They will grow up lacking. They will grow up hurting." I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I was terrified of becoming the publicly betrayed wife. I was terrified of the pitying looks from the other mothers at the school. For a fleeting, desperate moment, I actually considered abandoning the entire plan. I considered leaving the brown leather binder buried deep in the closet, letting Curtis take whatever he wanted, and just keeping the quiet, fragile peace for the sake of the kids. Then, another voice cut through the darkness. It was not a whisper, and it was not a trick of my exhausted mind. It was a crystal clear memory of my father, speaking to me from his hospital bed. Family is not a collection of people. Family is the absolute truth between those people. My eyes snapped open. The panic completely vanished, replaced by a cold, steady rush of adrenaline. My father was right. You have a choice, Tessie. You have the choice your mother never got to make. I turned my head and looked at the silhouette of my husband in the dark. He was the man who had forged my signature to steal the equity out of the very roof over our heads. He was the man who had bought a house for another woman while telling me we needed to tighten the grocery budget. He was the man waiting for my father to be buried in the dirt so he could legally steal my inheritance. Staying in this bed was not protecting my family. Staying was complicity. If I stayed, I would be teaching my son that a man could lie and steal from his wife without facing a single consequence. I would be teaching my daughter that a woman should swallow her voice and accept betrayal just to keep up appearances. Divorcing Curtis was not breaking my family. My husband had taken a sledgehammer to our family 5 years ago when he started driving down Interstate 95 south to Colleton County. I was not the destroyer. I was simply the one sweeping up the shattered glass. I waited until the clock on the nightstand clicked to 4 in the morning. I quietly slid out from under the heavy comforter, my bare feet sinking into the soft carpet. I did not turn on a single lamp. I walked silently into the master closet and shut the door behind me. I turned on the flashlight application on my cellular phone, placing it face up on the floor so it cast a harsh, white glow across the small space. The smell of cedar hangers and old shoe leather filled my lungs. The sound of Curtis snoring was completely muffled by the heavy wooden door. I reached up to the highest shelf and moved the stack of dusty shoeboxes. I pulled down the heavy brown leather binder. I sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor of the closet. I rested the binder on my lap and opened the thick cover. I bypassed the spreadsheets, the property deeds, and the copies of the forged notary stamps. I turned all the way to the very back. Page 48. It was the single sheet of lined notebook paper my father had added during his final days in the hospital. The handwriting was shaky, the letters jagged from the pain radiating through his failing liver, but the ink was pressed deeply into the paper. I traced the first word with my index finger. Tessie. I took a deep breath, the cedar air burning my throat, and began to read. If you are reading this, I am already gone. I am so sorry for that, sweetheart. I wanted to be standing right behind you when the trap finally closed. I know you are scared. I know you are terrified that the kids are going to hurt. But you need to know something, Tessie. The kids are going to hurt no matter what you do. The only difference is whether they are hurting inside the truth or hurting inside a lie. You cannot protect them from the pain of a broken world, but you can protect them from being deceived by it. Numbers do not lie. People do. I taught you that because I wanted you to live your entire life standing on the solid ground of the truth. Do not let him take another inch of your life. Take back your house. Take back your future. Your mother would be so incredibly proud of the woman you are today. I was proud of you every single day of my life. There was a small space, and then a final postscript written at the very bottom of the page. Check the copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins on your nightstand. I left something in there for you last week. I read the letter a second time. Then I read it a third time. With every pass, a new layer of the message settled into my bones. The first time I read it, I felt the crushing, suffocating grief of hearing my father speak to me from beyond the grave. The second time, I felt the iron resolve he was trying to transfer into my blood. He was not just telling me to be strong. He was telling me I already possessed the strength. The third time I read it, I felt the absolute, overwhelming weight of his love. Every single page in this binder, every late night he spent tracing stolen funds instead of resting, every hour he sat in the county records office, it was all an act of profound devotion. He had used the only language he truly mastered to save my life. I carefully closed the binder and left it on the closet floor. I opened the door and crept back into the dark bedroom. Curtis shifted in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent before settling back into his pillow. I walked around to my side of the bed. I reached out and picked up the worn paperback copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins from my nightstand. It was the book my mother had read to me before she died, the book that had sat untouched on that exact spot for 23 years. I opened the front cover. I slowly fanned the pages. A stiff piece of paper fluttered out and landed softly on the bedsheet. I picked it up and angled it toward the faint moonlight spilling through the window blinds. It was a cashier check drawn from my father's personal savings account. The amount was written in bold, dark ink, $25,000. On the memo line at the bottom, my dad had written 3 simple words, starting over fund. I stood in the dark, holding the paper. My father had taken his money and hidden it inside the last memory I had of my mother. He had placed my future quite literally inside my past. They had both prepared me for this exact moment from 2 different directions, across 2 different decades. My mother had given me a story about a girl surviving alone on an island. My father had given me the financial resources to build my own shelter. They were both telling me the exact same thing. You will be completely fine on your own. I walked back into the closet, placed the check safely inside the front pocket of the leather binder, and tied the thick leather strap tightly around the cover. I walked out to the kitchen and turned on the coffee maker. I used the cheap Folgers grounds my dad always drank. When the pot finished brewing, I poured myself a heavy ceramic mug. I did not add milk. I drank it completely black for the very first time in my life. It was bitter and harsh, but it burned a clean path all the way down my throat. Outside the window, the sky began to turn a pale, washed-out gray. It was Friday morning. It was the day of the funeral. It was the day Hank Blaine would be lowered into the damp South Carolina earth. And it was the day Curtis Webb would finally understand that a dying accountant had absolutely ruined his life with a stack of public records and a wooden pencil. I walked back to the bedroom to get dressed. I pulled the black dress from its hanger. I had bought it just 3 days ago at a department store in town. I slipped it over my head and zipped it up the back. The stiff paper retail tag was still attached to the inside of the collar. I deliberately chose not to cut it off. I wanted it there. I wanted the constant, scratching reminder against my skin that this dress was purchased because my father was dead, not because I was attending a social event. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on the back of the bedroom door. My eyes were slightly red, but they were completely dry. I wore my thin wire-rimmed glasses. I pulled my auburn hair back into a low, practical ponytail. I did not apply a single drop of makeup. I looked exactly like the woman Curtis thought I was. A quiet, unassuming school librarian, a mother of 2, a woman who would never cause a scene. I reached for my heavy leather tote bag, the one with my initials embossed on the side. I carefully packed my armor. I slid the brown leather binder into the bottom. I placed the thick manila envelope containing the fault-based divorce petition, the counterfilings, and the summary of assets right on top of it. Beside that, I tucked the wax-sealed envelope addressed to Floyd Griggs. Curtis walked out of the master bathroom. He smelled strongly of mint toothpaste and Acqua di Gio. He stepped in front of the mirror beside me and began adjusting his dark silk tie. I looked at him in the reflection. I looked at the dark fabric of his suit. I realized in that exact moment that it was the identical suit he had worn to our wedding 15 years ago. He had kept it in pristine condition. The irony was so sharp it almost cut my tongue. He was wearing the suit from the day he made his vows to the event where he planned to permanently break them. I watched his hands move efficiently, tightening the knot at his throat. He reached over to the dresser, picked up his own manila envelope, and slid it smoothly into the inner breast pocket of his wedding suit. He patted the pocket flat, ensuring the bulge of the papers was completely concealed. "Are you ready, Tess?" he asked, looking at me through the mirror with an expression of deep, manufactured sympathy. I looked back at him. My pulse was completely steady. My hands were perfectly still. 2 envelopes were currently sitting in this room. 2 completely different plans for the future. We were heading to the exact same funeral, but only one of us knew the entire truth about how the day was going to end. I picked up my leather tote bag and slid the heavy strap over my shoulder. "Ready," I said. The heavy oak doors of the First Baptist Church in Beaufort opened, and the smell of white lilies washed over me, so thick and sweet I could practically taste it in the back of my throat. I walked down the center aisle, my black dress rustling against the 80-year-old wooden pews. The paper retail tag I had deliberately left attached to the inside of my collar scratched against my neck. It was a sharp, constant reminder of exactly why I was here. Stained glass windows caught the morning sun, bleeding deep red and cobalt blue light across the cold stone floor. I sat in the front row. Curtis sat directly beside me, wearing the exact same dark suit he had worn to our wedding 15 years ago. Every time he shifted in the pew, a fresh wave of his expensive designer cologne drifted over me. He had sprayed it on heavily that morning to mask whatever sense he was carrying, playing the role of the perfectly supportive husband. Behind us, Archer sat completely straight, gripping the funeral program until his knuckles turned white. Bea leaned her head quietly against her brother's shoulder. Up on the altar, my father's wooden mahogany casket rested in the soft light. His reading glasses sat neatly on top of his closed leather Bible, exactly as he had requested. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and delivered a very short eulogy. I spoke about numbers and love. I told the congregation that my father was a man of numbers, a man who spent 40 years making sure the ledgers told the truth. I said that in the end, he spent his final weeks making sure the truth reached the people who needed it the most. The congregation nodded, thinking I was speaking generally about a long, honest life, but I was talking about the brown leather binder currently sitting at the bottom of my tote bag. After the final prayer, the reception line slowly thinned out. Hands were shaken, condolences were murmured. Curtis played his part beautifully, shaking hands and telling the neighbors what a great man my father had been. He was delivering an absolute masterclass in deception, taking a final bow after a 15-year performance. Then, just as the sanctuary began to empty, Curtis placed his hand flat against the small of my back. It was a firm, possessive grip. He guided me away from the lingering guests and into a quiet, shadowed alcove near the side exit. He reached into the inner pocket of his wedding suit and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He pressed it directly into my hands. "I have been thinking about this for a while, Tess," he said. His voice was pitched low, perfectly modulated, and entirely rehearsed. "I want out. Sign the papers." I looked down at the envelope resting in my palms. I did not open it. I did not need to see the documents inside to know they were a standard no-fault filing, offering an even split of the assets, designed for a grieving woman to sign blindly, just to make the pain go away. "You picked today," I said, my voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. "It is just timing, darling," he said, offering a sad, patronizing smile. "We both know this has not been working." I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my own manila envelope. My hand was as steady as my father's hand when he held his wooden pencil. I placed my envelope directly on top of his. "Dad helped me file these 6 weeks ago," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "Your name is already off everything." Curtis stared at the envelopes. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by absolute disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice dropping its gentle facade. "Fault-based divorce," I said, each word falling like a hammer on an anvil. "Adultery, forgery, 3 counts of felony fraud. Your attorney, the one Denise recommended to you? You should probably give them a call." I paused, letting the silence hang between us for one terrible second. "Oh, wait. Denise Griggs, 14 Osprey Lane. I wonder if Floyd knows about the house you bought her with my equity." The fear finally hit him. It drained all the color from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. He yanked his cell phone from his pocket. He dialed his lawyer. I watched him listen to the voicemail recording. He muttered a curse and dialed the number for our joint bank account. I heard the faint, automated voice through the speaker, informing him that the account information had been modified and he needed to contact a local branch. He dialed his lawyer a second time. The call would not even connect. His number had been blocked. His hand began to shake violently. The phone slipped from his fingers and crashed onto the stone floor, the screen shattering into a web of broken glass. From the sanctuary behind us, the organist began to play the opening chords of Amazing Grace. I reached down, picked up his shattered phone, and pressed it against his chest. "You will need this," I told him quietly. "Your lawyer will definitely want to talk. Whenever they decide to unblock your number." I turned my back and walked out of the alcove. I stepped into the bright light of the church corridor. I walked past my father's mahogany casket, resting my hand against the smooth wood for one brief second, and then I kept walking right out the front doors. Curtis stood entirely alone in the shadows, holding 2 envelopes he could not open and a broken phone he could not use. The silence inside that church belonged entirely to Hank Blaine. The very next morning, I drove down Interstate 95 South. I drove for 45 minutes, following the exact same route my husband had taken 3 or 4 nights a week for the last 4 years. I counted the highway toll booths as I passed through them, paying the fees one final time. I pulled into a quiet driveway in Colleton County and parked my car. I walked up to the front porch of a modest house and rang the bell. A man opened the door. He was 37 years old, wearing faded denim jeans and a heavy flannel shirt. His hands were calloused from years of electrical work. Floyd Griggs. He looked at me with polite confusion. He did not recognize me, and he did not recognize the vehicle parked in his driveway. "Mr. Griggs?" I asked. "My name is Tessa Blaine. My father just passed away. Right before he died, he asked me to deliver this directly to you." I reached into my tote bag and handed him the thick manila envelope sealed with heavy red wax. Floyd took it. He looked at the wax, then looked back at me. He broke the seal and pulled out the thick stack of papers. I stood on the porch and watched as a good man's entire reality was systematically dismantled. He looked at the copy of the property deed for 14 Osprey Lane. He saw Curtis Webb listed as the buyer, and Denise Griggs listed as the current resident. He flipped through the hotel receipts, the jewelry store transactions, the 5-year timeline, and the copies of the forged mortgage documents. Finally, he read the handwritten letter from my father. It was polite, entirely factual, and free of any judgment. It simply laid out the numbers. Floyd finished reading. He lowered the papers. The silence stretched out over the quiet suburban lawn. "Your father," Floyd said, his voice terrifyingly steady. "He found all of this?" "He was a forensic accountant," I replied. "Was?" "He died on Wednesday." Floyd looked down at the envelope, then looked back up at the house he thought his wife had helped pay for with honest real estate commissions. "He spent his last weeks working on this. For you?" "He spent his last weeks working on this for both of us," I said gently. Floyd carefully folded the letter and slid the papers back into the envelope. "Thank you, Mrs. Blaine," he said. He did not scream. He did not throw anything. He just possessed the absolute, terrifying calm of a man who suddenly understood everything. I walked back to my car. I did not look over my shoulder as I drove away. I did not need to. I knew Floyd was standing on his porch, pulling his cell phone from his pocket, dialing a lawyer of his own. The second detonation had just been triggered. My father had timed it perfectly. He wanted Curtis to suffer through 24 hours of knowing his wife had caught him, before getting hit with the absolute devastation of the other husband finding out. Over the next 2 weeks, the dominoes fell with spectacular, violent precision. I did not have to witness most of it in person. The updates came through phone calls from Astrid Keogh and the slow, inevitable churn of public records. On day 3, Floyd Griggs officially filed for divorce from Denise. Astrid's colleague in Colleton County confirmed the filing. The fallout over there was immediate and completely toxic. On day 5, a process server walked onto a commercial construction site and handed Curtis the official, fault-based divorce papers I had filed under seal weeks ago. The grounds were explicitly stated: adultery, forgery, and the dissipation of marital assets. Curtis panicked. He called my phone 11 times in a single hour. I did not answer a single call. He tried to call my father's house, but I had already disconnected the landline. On day 7, Astrid formally submitted the criminal complaint package to the Beaufort County District Attorney. She handed them the certified copies of the forged mortgage documents alongside my father's 47-page forensic audit. The district attorney opened a felony investigation that very same afternoon. On day 9, the State Highway Authority responded to a subpoena for the toll records. 4 years of transponder data proved my husband's commuting pattern down Interstate 95, corroborating the exact timeline of the affair and linking him directly to the property purchased with the stolen funds. On day 12, investigators knocked on the door of a notary public named R. Vickers. Confronted with the evidence, the notary immediately confessed. She gave a sworn statement confirming she had never met Tessa Blaine, and that her official stamp and signature had been entirely forged. It was a double forgery. My husband had not just faked my name, he had faked a state official's seal. That added another felony count to the growing list. By day 14, the South Carolina Labor, Licensing, and Regulation Board initiated an emergency review of my husband's commercial contractor license. Because he was facing multiple pending felony charges related to financial fraud, his active business contracts were immediately frozen. Astrid called me later that afternoon with the final legal summary. Under the state code, his proven adultery completely bars him from receiving any alimony, she explained, her voice practically humming with satisfaction. "We are claiming a dissipation credit of $214,800 against his share of the estate. After factoring in the fault grounds, you are going to retain nearly 70% of the remaining marital assets. The house is entirely yours." "What about the criminal charges?" I asked, looking out my kitchen window. "Forgery of mortgage documents, forgery of a notary seal, and filing false instruments, Astrid said. Each one is a felony. The district attorney is moving forward aggressively. His defense lawyer is already trying to negotiate a plea deal to keep him out of state prison. Denise Griggs did not fare much better. Because Floyd's divorce filing exposed her direct involvement with Curtis, she could no longer deny her participation in the fraudulent property purchase. Her real estate license was placed under immediate review. According to the private investigator, she tried to call Curtis repeatedly, begging him for help. For the first time in 5 years, Curtis Webb did not answer her calls. He was completely trapped under the weight of his own collapsing universe. 3 weeks after the funeral, the harsh winter finally broke. March arrived in Beaufort with a sudden, brilliant warmth. Pink and white azaleas bloomed outside the kitchen window, and the marshland turned a vibrant, living green. I stood in my kitchen. It was my house now. Curtis had been legally forced to vacate the premises by a court order granting me exclusive use of the marital home. The house was quiet, but it was an entirely new kind of quiet. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of a space where someone had abandoned us. It was the clean, breathable silence of a space where someone toxic had finally been removed. I poured myself a cup of Folgers coffee. I drank it black. The mockingbird sang in the oak trees outside. In the living room, Archer was curled up on the sofa reading a thick fantasy novel. Bea was sitting cross-legged on the floor, coloring a picture of a horse. The kids were adjusting. Archer knew enough of the truth to understand why his father was gone. A few nights earlier, he had asked me why his dad had done those things. I had looked my son in the eye and told him the absolute truth. I told him I did not know why, but I promised him that none of it was his fault. Archer had absorbed the information in complete silence. Then he had looked at me and asked if Grandpa had known. I told him yes, Grandpa had known everything. Archer had simply nodded and gone back to his book. He processed the world in quiet observation, just like I did. Bea was struggling a bit more. She was only 10 years old, and she asked almost every single day when her dad was coming back. I did not lie to her, but I also did not burden her with the felonies. I told her that Mom and Dad were going to live in separate houses from now on, but that her dad still loved her very much. It was only half of the story, but it was enough truth for a 10-year-old to carry for one day. Financially, my father had ensured we were completely bulletproof. I kept the house, the primary car, and primary custody of the children. Curtis was granted supervised visitation and ordered to pay child support out of whatever income he could scrape together. The irrevocable trust holding my father's estate, the land worth $350,000 and the savings account holding $90,000, remained totally untouched. Curtis would never be able to reach it. I walked back into my bedroom and set my coffee mug on the nightstand. I reached over and picked up the worn paperback copy of Island of the Blue Dolphins. It was the book my mother had read to me before she died. It was the exact same book my father had used to hide a cashier check for $25,000. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the front cover. I turned to the very first page and read the opening sentence out loud, my voice soft in the empty room. I remember the day the Aleut ship came to our island. It was a story about a young girl who was left completely alone on a remote island. She had to figure out how to build her own shelter. She had to learn how to forage for her own food. She had to learn how to defend herself against wild dogs. She had to survive the isolation, and eventually, she learned how to thrive in it. My mother had chosen that specific book for me. She had known she was leaving me. She had known I would need to learn how to survive on my own. 2 decades later, my father had hidden the financial resources for my survival inside those exact same pages. They had both prepared me for this solitary life. They had come at it from 2 different directions, across 2 different eras. My mother armed me with a story about resilience. My father armed me with the cold, protective power of mathematics. And they were both telling me the exact same thing. You will be okay. You can do this alone. I closed the book and set it carefully back on the nightstand. I walked out into the living room. Archer, Bea, I called out. Put your shoes on. Where are we going? Archer asked, marking his page. We are going down to the waterfront, I told them. We walked together under the massive oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. We walked right up to the edge of the Beaufort River, stopping at the exact iron railing where Curtis Webb had offered me a diamond ring and a lifetime of hollow promises 15 years ago. I stood in that exact same spot, but I was a completely different woman. I did not have a husband standing beside me. I did not have a father to call for advice. But I had a brown leather binder hidden in my closet, a letter written in shaky ink, a bank account in my own name, and the absolute, unbreakable solid ground of the truth beneath my feet. "Mom, look!" Bee shouted, pointing her small finger at the sparkling water. I looked out past the docks. 2 dolphins were cresting the surface of the river, their gray dorsal fins breaking the water in perfect, synchronized harmony. I looked at my children. I looked at the dark water. I looked up at the wide, clear blue sky of the South Carolina spring. "Yeah, baby," I said, resting my hands on their shoulders. "I see them. Sometimes, the people who promise to protect you are the very ones dismantling your foundation while you sleep." Tessa's journey reminds you that a true family is built on absolute honesty, not just a shared address or a quiet house. You cannot build a safe future on a ledger full of lies. When you sense that something is wrong, trust your instincts. Look at the numbers, check the paperwork, and never apologize for protecting your own stability. Financial abuse is quiet, but it is just as devastating as a raised hand. You have the absolute right to know exactly where your hard-earned equity is going. Have you ever discovered a hidden truth that completely changed the way you viewed someone you loved and trusted? How did you finally find the courage to rebuild your life after the foundation cracked? Share your story in the comments below, because your survival might just be the exact blueprint another woman needs to hear today.